Hi, my name is Grace. I was born in Guatemala. I'm an Indigenous Maya, and I'm rediscovering my roots, I guess. I was raised here in the United States. Today I'm going to be reading Popul Vuh, translated from the original Maya text, and I did research to find which is the closest to the Indigenous book itself, and Alan J. Christenson, that's the name that came up of his translation. And let me just read the back of it for you, okay? The Popol Vuh is the most important example of Maya literature to have survived the Spanish conquest. It is also one of the world's great creation accounts, comparable to the beauty and power of Genesis. Most previous translations have relied on Spanish versions rather than the original Quiche Maya text. Based on the 10 years of research by a leading scholar of Maya literature, this translation with extensive notes is uniquely faithful to the original language. Retaining the poetic style of the original text, the translation is also remarkably accessible to English readers. Illustrated with more than 80 drawings, photographs, and maps, Alan J. Christenson's authoritative version brings out the richness and elegance of this sublime work of literature, comparable to such epic masterpieces as the Ramayana and Mahabharata in India, or the Iliad or Odyssey of Greece. Okay, so let's just begin. Okay, this is the acknowledgements. Page 12. And I do apologize for all mispronunciations. I am trying my best. Okay. This volume is the culmination of nearly 25 years of collaboration with friends and colleagues who have been more than generous with their time, expertise, encouragement, and at times sympathy. It has become a somewhat cliched and expected thing to claim that a work would not be possible without such support. It is nonetheless true, at least from my experience, and I am indebted to all those who helped me move the process along. First and foremost, I would like to express my sincerest gratitude to my Maya teachers, colleagues, and friends who have selflessly devoted their time and knowledge to help carry out this project. Without their efforts, none of it would have gotten off the ground. I would like to particularly recognize in this regard Don Vincent de Leon Abach, who, with patience and kindness, guided me through the complexity and poetry of Quiche theology and ceremonialism. Without his wisdom, I would have missed much of the beauty of the ancestral vision that is woven into the very fabric of Popol Vuh. I dearly miss him. I would also like to acknowledge the profound influence that Antonio Ajutar Vasquez had on this work. It was his kind and gentle voice that I often heard when I struggled at times to understand the ancient words of this text. Others who have aided this work include Diego Chavez Petsy, Nicholas Chavez Sojuli, Felix Choi, Gregorio Chu, Juan Mendoza, Francisco Mendoza, and Juan Zarate. I am deeply indebted to Jim Mondlock for his extraordinary generosity in offering to read through the translation. His depth and knowledge with regard to Quiche grammar, syntax, and modern usage were invaluable. I purchased a copy of his basic Quiche grammar in 1976 to help me in my quest to learn the language at the time when such aids were rare. The book was a steadfast friend and companion during the next few years. Not only was it brilliant work, but it proved to be just the size and weight to dispatch mosquitoes on the wall of my adobe shack. I thus owe to him not only much of my initial knowledge of the Quiche language, but my red blood cell count in those days as well. I am also grateful to John Robertson for his guidance, particularly with regards to the orthography of the text. He was a patient educator to me when I began work with the Quiche language nearly 25 years ago, helping to prepare a dictionary and grammar. He was the ideal boss and a wise teacher. It is a great honor for me to occupy the office next door to his at the university. I am sincerely indebted to my friend and colleague Rudd Van Ackern, who went to the extraordinary lengths to share with me his profound understanding of Highland Maya ethnohistory. I value his knowledge, experience, and generosity in reading through various versions of this volume and offering his insights. As in much of what I do that is of worth in the academia world, I acknowledge the influence of my mother, Linda Shelley. As a graduate student, Linda encouraged me to complete the translation of the Popul Vuh at the time when I was get down right now. Jackie? I'm not in the mood. I'm not in the mood. Gosh. Linda encouraged me to complete the translation of the Popol Vuh at a time when I was content to throw up my hands after I had worked through the mythic sections. It was her love for the Maya people and passion for their language that reminded me why we take on overwhelming tasks such as this, and why it's worth the price in life and heart that we put into them. Among the many who have contributed in invaluable ways to this project, I would like to recognize with my sincerest thanks to, it's just a lot of names. I would also like to thank my graduate students who keep me constantly on my toes and challenged with their curiosity and energy. Among these students, Spencer Jardine helped me with the initial transcription of the text used in this volume, and Scott Bryan created the beautiful maps. I am indebted to them for their efforts. Translations preface. A little over 20 years ago, I was helping to compile a dictionary in the Quiche Maya language in the mountains of northwestern Guatemala, near a small village called Chichul. At the time, Quiche was almost completely an orally communicated language, with very few native speakers who could read or write it. One summer evening, after a long day of work with one of my best sources, I realized that I had lost track of time and needed to hurry down to the village where I had a small home before it got dark. Hold on. Okay. The region had no electricity, and hiking steep mountain trails at night was dangerous, particularly because of the numerous packs of wild and often rabid dogs that roamed freely about. I therefore started down a small footpath that appeared to be a more direct route than the usual winding road taken by buses. About a third of the way down the mountainside, I passed an isolated adobe and thatch hut built in a clearing surrounded by pine forest. A small group of men were seated on a low wooden bench in front of the house, conversing. When they saw me, they called out a greeting and beckoned me to join them. After introductions were properly exchanged, a requirement in formal Quiche conversation, I was offered a warm cup of toasted corn coffee, and a space on the bench was opened up for me to sit down. One of the men had heard that there was a fair-skinned young man that people called Rakus, mosquito legs, who was visiting in Chihuly, and he asked if that would be me. My name is difficult to pronounce in Quiche, so I had been given the rather unfortunate nickname, derived no doubt from my lanky physique in those days. I told them that I was the one they had heard about. They asked what I was doing, and I explained that I was interested in collecting words of his people so that I could carry them with me back to my own town beyond the mountains to the north. Another of the men was curious as to how I could collect words and carry them away, since he assumed that his language could only be spoken and not written. Quiches in the area had, of course, seen documents and books like the Bible written in Spanish, but had little conception of at the time that it was possible to use phonic letters to record their own language. This is a great tragedy because until about 500 years ago, the Maya were the most literate people in the Americas, preserving their history and culture with a sophisticated hieroglyphic script in hundreds of folded screen books. The Spanish conquest in the early 16th century was a devastating blow to Maya literacy in Mexico and Guatemala. Christian missionaries burned great numbers of hieroglyphic texts in an attempt to eradicate indigenous religious practices. Native scribes were singled out for their persecution to such an extent that within 100 years the art of hieroglyphic writing had virtually disappeared from among the Maya people. My new friends were therefore very interested in the notes I had written that day in their language. Excited by the possibility of preserving their own thoughts in written form, they asked me to demonstrate how to write a number of words and phrases. After writing a few phrases to them in Quiche, I asked the oldest of them if he would like me to write something for him. He said that he did, and I waited a long time for the words he wished for me to write. Finally, he asked me to record a few brief words of counsel for his son. I didn't know it at the time, but his 5-year-old boy was the last of 12 children, all of whom had died in childhood, mostly to tuberculosis. That week, his last surviving child had begun to cough up blood, and he knew that his hope for posterity would inevitably die with him. By this time, I knew I would never make it down to the valley before dark, so my elderly friend invited me to stay in his corn loft. Before the others left for the night, I asked if they would like to hear the words of their fathers. This was greeted with indulgent smiles of disbelief, since few of their parents were alive and they were sure that I couldn't have known them. But I told them that it wasn't their father's words that I carried with me, but rather those of their father's fathers, repeated many times, fathers, dating back nearly 500 years. I happened to have with me a copy of the Popul Vuh manuscript, a book that was compiled in the mid-16th century at a town that still exists less than 30 miles from where we sat. I began to read the first page of the book. This is the account of when all is still silent and placid. All is silent and calm. Hushed and empty is the womb of the sky. These, then, are the first words, the first speech. There is not yet one person, one animal, bird, fish, crab, tree, rock, hollow, canyon, meadow, or forest. All alone the sky exists. The face of the earth has not yet appeared. Alone lies the expanse of the sea, along with the womb of the sky. There is not yet anything gathered together. All is at rest. Nothing stirs. All is languid, a rest in the sky. There is not yet anything standing erect. Only the expanse of water, only the tranquil sea lies below. There is not yet anything that might exist. All lies placid and silent in the darkness and the night. All alone were the framer and the shaper, sovereign and Quetzal serpent. They who have borne children and they who have begotten sons. Luminous they are in the water, wrapped in Quetzal feathers and Cotinga feathers. Popul Vuh, page 67 through 69. After I read a page or two from the account of the creation of the earth, I stopped and waited for their reaction. No one spoke for some time. Finally, the elderly man with the sick boy asked if he might hold the unbound pages of the manuscript copy for a moment. He gently took it from my hands and with great care turned the pages. "These are the words of my ancient fathers?" he asks. "Yes." "Do you know what you have done for them?" I wasn't quite sure what he meant, so I didn't answer at first. "You make them live again by speaking their words." The word he used was kastaka kwaska, meaning to cause to have life or to resurrect. The written word has the power to survive the death of its author, to preserve the most precious sovereigns of human existence, thoughts, hopes, ideals, and acquaintances with the sacred. We tend to take writing for granted. The Maya do not. The ability to write words and have them preserved long after the death of the author is a miracle. Many of the larger Highland Maya communities possess wooden chests containing books and clothing owned by their ancestors, which they revere as precious relics. These objects are said to bear the kuiks, or heart, of the ancestors. On special occasions, the contents are removed ceremonially to feed them offerings with incense and prayers. Many of these books are of great antiquity. I attended the opening of one of these old chests in the town of Santiago Atitlan, which contained a number of loose manuscripts pages, birth and death registries, and several bound leather books, one of which I could see was a 17th century missal. When brought out into the open, such books are reverently offered incense and prayers, but no attempt is made to open them or read them. Partly this is because few contemporary Maya know how to read the early script of the colonial period, and partly out of respect for the words themselves. When the words of the ancestors are read or spoken aloud, it is as if that person has returned from the death to speak again. Reading ancient texts is therefore a very delicate matter, filled with peril if the words are not treated with sufficient respect. While working as an ethnographer and translator in the Guatemalan highlands, I collaborated with a number of Maya shaman priests called Akajaba, also means they of the days or daykeepers. Prior to reading the words of ancient Maya manuscripts like the Popul Vuh, it was customary for one of them, Don Vincent de Leon Abac of Mamostanago, to first purify my copy of the text by waving copal incense smoke over it and asking forgiveness of the ancestors who have written the original for disturbing them. When I asked why he did this, he replied that to read the thoughts of ancient ancestors is to make their spirits present in the room and give them a living voice. Such power must be approached with great seriousness and all care taken to be faithful to the original ideas in any transcript or translation. At the end of our work sessions, he politely dismissed the gods and ancestors involved in that day's reading with his thanks and asked pardon for any offense we might have given. Most of the people who have lived on the American continent prior to the arrival of Europeans lacked a written script. Even in Mesoamerica, where the arrival of Europeans even in Mesoamerica, where there is a long tradition of hieroglyphic writing among some of the ancient cultures of the region, such as the Maya and Zapotecs, other neighboring cultures preserve their history and theology principally through the spoken word passed from generation to generation. This was true even of highly sophisticated cultures such as the Aztecs, who painted text relied primarily on the rebus or picture form of writing, incapable of recording abstract ideas phonically. Yet the concept of oral poetry held by the Aztecs is exemplary of the view of such discourse through Mesoamerica, including the Maya. For the ancient Aztecs, the highest form of sacred communication was poetry, what they called Quetzalcoatl, or flower song. These were delicately beautiful hymns meant to be recited orally, often to musical accompaniment. In paintings, Aztec poets are depicted with speech rolls issuing from their mouths. These scrolls were often colored a rich blue or green, symbolic of the precious nature of the poet's words, as if they were composed of jade or sacred quetzal feathers. Aztecs looked upon poetry as the actualization of a creative act inspired by divinities who were called upon to be present at the performance. Thus, the poet Ayocuan Paltzan of Tecamacalaco believed that his songs came from heaven, but lamented that his own words could not express them as they came undefiled from the gods. It said the poem, from within the heavens they come, the beautiful flowers, the beautiful songs. Our longing spoils them. Our inventiveness makes them lose their fragrance. Translated by Leon Portilla, 1880. Such songs exist only at the moment of their performance, their sound hanging briefly in the air, then fading to silence. It is only when they are spoken that they reveal their divine origin, transforming the poet into a messenger of deity. Now I am going to forge songs, make a stem flowering with songs. Oh, my friends, God has sent me as a messenger. I am transformed into a poem. Excuse me. Most poems were learned by heart and were lost forever if forgotten. Thus, Aztec poetry has no permanent reality of its own, no more than a dream. It is only by an accident of history that we know of them at all. Soon after the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire in 1521, a few Spanish missionaries such as Andres de Olmos and Bernardino de Sahuagin attempted to preserve long transcripts of ancient Aztec history, theology, and poetry utilizing the Latin script. The Olmos and Sahuagin relied for these accounts on elderly members of the Aztec nobility who had memorized them in their youth. Unfortunately, these invaluable books were vigorously suppressed soon after their completion for fear that the Indians would learn of them and use them as an excuse to revert to their former paganism. Sahuagin himself faced censure in 1577 for his work during the reign of King Philip II, who ordered his representative in Mexico to gather all copies of Sahuagin transcriptions of Aztec texts and secrete them away. It seems that it is not proper that this book be published or disseminated in those places. We thus command that upon receiving this quidella, you obtain these books with great care and diligence, that you make sure there is no original or copy of them is left there, and that you have them sent in good hands at the first opportunity to the Council of Indies, in order that they may be examined there. And you are warned absolutely not to allow any person to write concerning the superstitions and way of life of these Indians in any language, for this is not proper to God's service and to ours. Leo Portilla. The Spanish authorities realized that preserving a record of the literary heritage of the Aztecs constituted an intolerable danger to their own political and religious domination of the region. By suppressing cultural memories, missionaries could not more effectively extirpated from the life of the people they sought to convert to Christianity. The suppression of indigenous culture was far more difficult among the Maya, who did not have to rely on the spoken word to preserve their literary heritage. More than 1,500 years prior to the Spanish conquest, the Maya developed a sophisticated hieroglyphic script capable of recording complex literary compositions both on folded screen codices made of bark paper, as well as text incised on more durable stone or wood. The importance of preserving written records was a hallmark of Maya culture, as witnessed by the thousands of known hieroglyphic inscriptions, many more of which are still being discovered in the jungles of southern Mexico and northern Central America. Being a phonic script rather than a pictorial form of writing, Maya hieroglyphics were capable of recording any idea that could be spoken. Ancient Maya scribes were among the most honored members of creative society. They were often important representatives of the royal family, and as such, they were believed to carry the seeds of divinity within their blood. Among the titles given to the artists and scribes in classic period Maya inscriptions were Itzat, sage, and Miyats, wise one. In an important royal tomb at Tikal, burial 116, an incised bone depicts a deity class in an incised bone depicts a scribe's hand emerging from the gullet of an open-mouthed creature. In classic Maya art, the open jaws represent a portal that leads from this world to the world of the gods. In his or her hand is a calligraphic paintbrush used to both write and illustrate the ancient Maya codec books. The message of this incised bone is that the activities of this scribe come closest to those of the gods themselves, who paint the realities of this world as divine artists. The Spanish conquest of the Maya region in the 16th century resulted in the abrupt destruction of indigenous political power, as well as many of its cultural institutions. Christianity was formally established in Guatemala in 1534 under Bishop Francisco Marroquin, who sent out priests with portable altars to various highland Maya towns and villages in an effort to baptize the indigenous population and to destroy any remnants of idolatry that they might find. Ancient temples, as well as the carved and painted images which they contained, were systematically destroyed, their stones used to build Christian churches. Missionaries singled out hieroglyphic codices for destruction in an effort to protect the Indians from their former religious beliefs. Alonso de Zorita wrote that in 1540 he saw numerous such books in the Guatemalan highlands which recorded their history for more than 800 years back and which were interpreted for me by very ancient Indians, end quote. Bartolome de las Casas lamented that when found, such books were destroyed. These books were seen by our clergy, and even I saw part of those which were burned by the monks, apparently because they thought they might harm the Indians in matters concerning religion, since at the time they were at the beginning of their conversion. Las Casas, I don't even know what year that is for, sorry. One of the most zealous of these early missionaries was Diego de Landa, who burned hundreds of ancient Maya books while serving as the bishop of Mane in northern Yucatan. We found a large number of books of these characters, and as they contained nothing in which they were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction. One of the numerous hieroglyphic books that once existed in the Maya lowlands, all that escaped the Spanish purchase of the 16th century, are 4 incomplete codices. Of those written in the highlands of Guatemala, not a single pre-Columbian codex is known to have survived. But these tragic acts of destruction did not mean that Maya literacy ended with the arrival of the Europeans. Soon after the Spanish conquest, literate members of the Highland Maya nobility made a number of transcriptions of their pre-Columbian books, utilizing a modified Latin script in an effort to preserve what they could of their recorded history and culture before they could be destroyed or lost. By far the most important extant example of such a transcription is the Popul Vuh, this book, a lengthy document composed by anonymous members of the Quiche Maya aristocracy. I know that, aristocrats in Guatemala, soon after the fall of their capital city to the Spanish conquerors. The authors of the manuscript describe the text as an instrument of sight by which the reader may, quote, envision, end quote, the thoughts and actions of the gods and sacred ancestors from the beginning of time and into the future. The opening chapters of the Popul Vuh describe the creation of all things as if it were occurring in the immediate present, time folding back upon itself to transport the reader into the primordial waters of chaos at the very moment the first land emerged. This is the account of when all is still silent and placid. All is silent and calm. Hushed and empty is the womb of the sky. The face of the earth has not yet appeared. Alone lies the expanse of the sea, along with the womb of all the sky. There is not yet anything gathered together. All is at rest. Nothing stirs. This passage is written in present progressive tense, suggesting that the narrator sees it before him as he writes. This is consistent with the way stories are told in contemporary Quiche households. The storyteller invites the listener to imagine the setting of his tale and nearly always tells the story as if it were happening right then, even if it happened in the distant or mythic past. The text of the Popul Vuh was kept hidden by indigenous elders for centuries in the town of Chichicastenango in Guatemala. So successful were these efforts to preserve early colonial texts that 200 years after the conquest, a Spanish priest living in Chichicastenango named Francisco Jimenez wrote that the people of the town possessed many ancient books, including the manuscript of the Popul Vuh. Jimenez wrote that these books were kept in secret so that local Christian authorities would not learn of them. Far from being forgotten tales, he found that these texts were the doctrine which they first imbibed with their mother's milk, and that all of them knew it almost by heart. Jimenez was able to convince the elders who kept the Popol Vuh manuscript to allow him to borrow it for the purpose of making a copy. After Jimenez made his copy, the original text was presumably given back to the Maya, although it has not been seen since the early 1700s. Today, we, in the Western world, know of this great book only through Jimenez's transcription, which has become one of the principal resources used by European and American scholars who study Maya history and theology. It is unfortunate, however, that the great majority of Maya people have not had access to it for centuries in their own language. Literacy has slowly eroded away among the contemporary Maya, such that few are literate in their native tongue. The sacred roads of the Maya were forcibly taken from them and destroyed in the fires of the Spanish conquest. It is only in the past 100 years or so that the fragments of what they have lost are beginning to be rediscovered and read widely. For the Maya, each ancient word, whether read or spoken aloud, is life-giving in its power to reach across the centuries. The Maya people can understand the preciousness of such documents in ways that we who have never been denied literacy can hardly imagine. In preparing this translation of the Popol Vuh, I often remembered that evening near Chiculi, where I had the opportunity to read passages from this great book to the author's descendants. The words were meant for them, not for me. In translating the text, I have tried to bear in mind that this process gives voice to the ancients so that their words may be heard again. It is my sincerest hopes that I have been faithful to their voices. This work is published in 2 volumes. First consists of an English translation of the Popol Vuh with commentary aimed at elucidating the meaning of the text in light of contemporary Highland Maya speech and practices, as well as the current scholarship in Maya linguistics, archaeology, ethnography, and art historical iconography. No text can be translated from one language into another without losing a certain amount of the beauty and nuance of the original. The poet Stephen Mallarmé felt that his poetry should never be translated because the symbolism, flow, and the sound of the words were so closely bound to the French language. To convey even a portion of the occasional meaning that colored his poems would require extensive notes explaining it, and for Mallarmé to name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the enjoyment to be found in the poem, which consists in the pleasure of discovering things little by little. Suggestion, that is the dream. To a great extent, this is also true of the language found in the Popul Vuh, which is replete with esoteric language, plays on words, and phrases chosen for their sound and rhythm as much as for their meaning. I've tried to adhere as closely as possible to the tone and syntax of the Quiche text. However, certain liberties are unavoidable in order to make the narrative understandable in the English language. For example, the Quiche language stresses passive verb constructions, which when translated into European languages are difficult to follow. The authors of the Popul Vuh also routinely use passive forms to generate grunts that they are hopelessly awkward in English. Thus, the words, quote, manifestation, declaration, and expression, end quote, in lines 11 through 13 are actually written, quote, it's being manifested, it's being declared, it's being expressed, end quote. To partially compensate for the inadequacy of a grammatic English version to adhere precisely to the wording of the original, the second volume of the works contain a, quote, literal, word-for-word translation of the texts. I have chosen to use this arrangement because I believe that language is reflective of the flavor of the culture that utilizes it. When the original phraseology and grammatical construction of the ancient text is preserved, subtle nuances of the meaning become more evident. The first... Ooh, that made me mad. It was my cat. When the original phraseology and grammatical construction of the ancient text is preserved, subtle nuances of the meaning become evident. The first line of the Popul Vuh declares the book to be Wuxi Orgar-Tishi, which may translate it literally as, quote, its root ancient word, end quote. The phrase indicates that this is the beginning of the ancient history of the Quiche people. The remainder of the book is thus seen as growing like a plant from this root. The imagery is a beautiful expression of the Quiche worldview as an agricultural society. One of my hopes for this project was to make the original Quiche text of the Popul Vuh available to the Quiche people themselves in a form that is consistent with modern script taught in Guatemalan school systems. I have therefore utilized in the literal translation an entirely new transcription of the original Quiche text using modern orthography. I have also included a transcription of the Latin orthograph version of the Popul Vuh, as it is written by its Quiche authors in the 17th century for comparative purposes. The Popul Vuh is the most important example of pre-Columbian Maya literacy to have survived the Spanish conquest. Its significance may be seen in the numerous versions of the text that have been published. In the past 300 years, the Popul Vuh has been translated approximately 30 times into 7 languages. Unfortunately, most of these translations were not based on the original Quiche Maya text, but rather on various Spanish versions derived from it. The translation combined in this book is entirely new, based primarily on my own knowledge of the language, as well as dictionaries and grammars compiled in the last century by Garcia Iluguata and many other people. I have also relied on consultants with native Quiche speakers in the highland Guatemalan towns of Momostenango and surrounding places of Santa Ana, Kitsaja, Niminstu, and Panka. Also Totonikampan, and the areas of Nimisak, Kuchima, and Cerro de Oro, and Nuala, and Cuen, and the areas of Los Triangles, Exclamala, Extac, Las Grutas, G2, and Exponum, and Chiluque. It is fortunate in this regard that the Quiche language has changed surprisingly little in the centuries since the Popul Vuh was composed. With important exceptions, most of the vocabulary is still understandable to the modern Quiches. For terms and phrases associated with Maya religion and ritual, I've also worked with a number of Quiche Akabe Ichbab, the daykeepers, who continue to conduct traditional calendric and divinatory rites in a manner little different from that practice at the time the Popul Vuh was compiled. I am particularly indebted to Don Vince de Leon Abaque of Momostenago for his wisdom and patience with me in this regard. For archaic and non-Maya loan words, which are no longer used by modern Quiches, I have relied on dictionaries, grammars, and theology treatises prepared by Spanish priests in the early colonial period, principally those compiled by Domingo de Vico, Francisco Mariquin, Alonso de Molina, Marcos Martinez. Oh, lots of people, okay. Translation is an art whose cloth is woven from a variety of threads. Any defects are solely the fault of the weaver. Its beauty is solely dependent on the threads themselves. That's written by Alan J. Christenson, Provo, Utah, December 27th, 2002. And that was the translator's preface. Okay, and then we get into the introduction. So for next time, we'll start on page 26. I'm sure it's going to show backwards, but this is a picture of the book. Yeah, 2002. But yeah, thanks for joining me.